Okay, folks, I think it's time for us to jump in and get underway. Um, Welcome to Museums and Change, and thank you for joining us today. Special thanks to Kyle Bowen, Amanda Bohm Garcia, and Joan Canagan for presenting today. I also want to thank Addie Gayoso, my partner in crime. She's the one who's sending you notes in the chat function and smiling right up there. Uh, our three speakers will talk about the need to shift from a focus on institutional outputs to community outcomes and what that shift might mean for strategy, stakeholder relationships, and resource allocation. This shift entails both changes in institutional structures and in individual habits. Both present, both present fundamental challenges to our current professional mindsets and practices. A few quick housekeeping details. The session is being recorded. We'll make a link available via the AAM open forum ASAP, probably tomorrow morning. Unless you are recognized to speak, please hit your mute button so we don't get noise pollution during the session. If you want or need captioning, please activate captions on your Zoom dashboard. You have that capacity. If you want to share a question or a comment, please use the raised hand signal. You will go into a queue and I will recognize you as quickly as possible. Do use the chat function to make comments, pose questions, and enter citations of relevant literature and so on. That way we can manage a second parallel conversation. If you want to be added to our email list to receive direct notices of future sessions, please enter your name and email address in the chat or write to me directly via email. We'll happily add you to our list and you'll get email notices in advance of each meeting. Because our second regular date in November falls on Thanksgiving, our next session will convene on December 11th when Julie Oakes Dweck, Chief Curator of the Princeton Art Museum, I'm sure you've been reading about this one in the press, will speak about rethinking the 21st century art museum. Please plan to join us then. I'm speaking to you from Philadelphia, where I live on the ancestral lands of the Lenni Lenape and where the Lenni Lenape still reside. I believe it is our responsibility to learn about the indigenous peoples who lived here before us and to share our knowledge with our colleagues, constituents, and clients. Without further ado, Kyle, the floor is yours.
You, let's see, start sharing here. All right. Yeah, thanks, Avi, and thanks, Addie, for inviting us to share with everyone today. I am Kyle Bowen. I am the principal at Museums is Progress. And with me today are Amanda Bohm Garcia from the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art at the University of Oklahoma, and Joan Canagan, CEO at the Western Development Museum, which has sites in Saskatchewan. So we're going to discuss a shift we're seeing among museums, this transition from outputs to outcomes, and what it means for museum professionals and the expertise they offer. So expertise is what makes museums special, but it's also what can hold them back. So we recognize and appreciate expertise through the products and experiences that museums offer. You know, these are familiar outputs like programs, exhibits, campaigns, appeals. Those are all outputs, but they're not where the value of the institution lies. The value for a museum's users and its communities lies in the well-being outcomes that all those activities support. So when a funder asks, you know, what difference did this make for your community, or a board member wants to understand social impact, pointing to outputs as evidence of value will only persuade a minority And that minority is largely people who are like museum professionals themselves, people who appreciate museums in what we might call traditional terms. So talking about a record number of visitors, high engagement scores, award-winning design, these kinds of output-focused results are really powerful proof for those who are invested in museums as we've known them and the expertise that makes them possible. But for those who are invested in, the social, intellectual, personal, physical well-being of a community, which is probably a lot more people, they don't say that much at all. So what are well-being outcomes? What do they look like? These are actual well-being outcomes that museums can support, right? So you see here, we've got these categories of physical, intellectual, personal, social. And I will share with you actually in the chat link, a link. Whoops. Oh, that's to the waiting room. Sorry. Let me see if I can do that instead. All right. So now you can click on that and access our board here. These outcomes were developed by our partner, John Falk, who's here today. And you can click on this link in this slide if you'd like to get a full view of all the different well-being outcomes, as well as aggregate scores on how our MAP participants are their results as they've participated in our outcomes assessment. You can see I've got some icons here of Joan and Amanda. That actually indicates that these are outcomes that their respective museum staff feel more confident, right? That they're regularly providing to visitors. So when we talk about, testing translation, I'm going to introduce you to Amanda and Joan. First, Amanda, and these folks are people who have been deeply invested in this past year in realizing this shift from outputs to outcomes. And Amanda is the head of museum experiences at the FJJMA. And Amanda is integrating outcome-centered practices across multiple departments. So curatorial, learning, marketing, visitor services, and she and her colleagues are translating outcomes into operational changes in some pretty exciting ways throughout the institution. We'll hear from Amanda first, and then Joan. Joan has been repositioning her institution's value to provincial government stakeholders, moving from this kind of cultural preservation language to community outcomes language. And both these museums completed our strategic assessment program early in 2025 to understand, what outcomes their institutions may be uniquely positioned to support. And throughout the year, they've been working in some advanced implementation work. Amanda through our value realization program, and Joan through both the value realization and the value articulation intensive. So they're not doing this alone. They're working with other institutions in our community and working through these programs to support this kind of ongoing translation work. So Amanda's going to share first what she's learning, and then Amanda will hand off directly over to Joan. And after they present, I'll share a few closing thoughts before we have some discussion. Amanda, how does that sound to you?
Sounds perfect. Thank you, Kyle.
All right. All
Okay.
you.
Oh, all right. So I'm going to walk everyone through how we're making the shift to working with visitor outcomes at FJJMA. I'll do that by sharing some of the practical exercises we've been using, as well as a basic framework for leading with change. But before I get started, I would like to give you a little context to the FRED. So beginning in 2016 and through the pandemic, our museum experienced an overall 40% reduction in funding support from the university, as well as a 45% reduction in staff. When you experience cutbacks that significant, it's almost like starting from scratch. Next slide. There we are, which can be a little terrifying, to be honest, but it can also be extremely generative and fertile ground for new ideas to take shape. One of the first things we did was to restructure the staff and to create a new strategic plan. Next slide. So a huge part of our strategic plan is about shifting to a visitor-focused institution. As you can imagine, this is easier said than done and requires not only a repositioning of the work, but also a mindset shift within your teams that has to occur as well. Next slide. So when making any big change in any institution, whether or not it's outputs to outcomes or really anything else, there's a few ways you can go about it. So the first option is the bull in the china shop analogy, right? You can come in and smash everything to bits, and in no time at all, you've cleared out the old system. The benefit is it sure is quick, but I wouldn't say it's painless. Not only have you smashed the china, but you may also have smashed any sense of safety with your team. Certainly, there are times when this strategy may be necessary, but with a mindset shift like the one we're talking about today, this is not the best approach and not the direction we have taken at FJJMA. The second option is to remain the bull in the china shop, but to carefully tiptoe around everything. If you've ever seen Disney's movie Ferdinand, you can picture the scene with the bull trying very carefully to navigate the shop without upsetting or breaking any dishes. The problem with this is that this strategy is too safe and nothing really changes and the status quo remains the same. Next slide, please. So we've opted for the third option, which is not to destroy, not to leave untouched, but to carefully pack up the china from the past to make room for the new. This allows for compassion for those that are still working in the old system and appreciation for the history that brought your institution to where it is now, even if that is on the precipice of great change. Next slide. So as you can imagine, we did a lot of work to pack our boxes, which is truly a whole other webinar, but we now have some space. There is certainly more to clear out, and we're constantly on the lookout for someone who might want to unpack a box and bring out a favorite old piece. But regardless, we're at a place now where we can stretch, imagine, and play. Next slide. So we are still experimenting with different ways to work with visitor outcomes, but the three most important things we have learned so far are the following. Establish a shared language with terminology everyone understands. Do not put visitor outcomes into silos. Everyone must share in this work together. And support yourself and your colleagues on the long road ahead. Next slide. So creating a shared language really began for us during our strategic planning process, and it's something we continually work on. We have bi-monthly all-staff meetings that include discussions about new terminology related to visitors and how these terms are being used and why. These all-staff meetings literally include all staff, from security guards to the front desk. We lock the doors and everyone gathers. It might surprise you to know that some of the most insightful feedback I've gotten has come from our security team. Next slide. So to keep outcomes from becoming siloed primarily in an education or learning department, we started incorporating visitor outcomes into exhibition development, partially because exhibitions stretch across all departments and divisions. Next slide. So we have pictured here 4 visitor outcomes that could be supported by a specific exhibit currently in development at the museum. To give you an idea, a few of the outcomes are: give users something to talk about with friends and family, and allow users to feel free from work or routine. Each division is tasked with adding to the board how their exhibition work supports each outcome. This allows team members to think about their expertise and its direct relationship to our visitors. It's been really exciting to witness, especially for colleagues in finance or in the prep and installation team, who might feel separated from visitors, to see their roles from an entirely new perspective, with an impact that they might not have thought was possible. Next slide. So these are just a few of the many ways we are incorporating visitor outcomes into our work. There is still so much to learn and many more steps we need to take. But looking out from the place of the beginning, where we are now, the journey ahead can feel incredibly far, almost unreachable. But in those moments, the way to keep momentum is to concentrate on the steps just in front of you. Piece by piece, bit by bit, no matter how small, the journey continues. One of my favorite quotes our director Thomas Smith is fond of saying is, "If you want to go quickly, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together." And with that, I will now hand things over to my colleague, Joan. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, Amanda. Well, thank you everybody for being here to listen to this today. So one of the things that we've really been working on at the Western Development Museum has been more, not so much the program outcomes, because that's something our funders have been asking us for many, many years. So my team is very used to talking about outcomes from a programming perspective. But one of the things that I've really started focusing on is the idea of organizational outcomes, particularly because I've been really influenced by the work of Stephen Weil on Making Museums Matter and Simon Sinek on the importance of knowing your why. Also for the WDM, an outcome focus is really embedded in the form of the governance model that our board has chosen to work with, because it emphasizes outcomes, or what we refer to as an ends policy, which essentially defines what good for whom and at what cost. So I have a board that's also very much focused on outcomes and ends over means. But as an institution, outcomes are really about why we exist, and they're our attempt to articulate how communities and the people we serve benefit from the fact that they have a WDM location in their city or in the province. So what we're doing for the betterment of the community. Next slide, please. And so for us, this has really been the ends versus means, but it always starts with kind of that why. So over the years, I've used Simon Sinek's Golden Circle as a way to challenge us to think beyond what we do internally as a museum, to describing the difference we're hoping to make in service to society. And I will send the link if you haven't seen Simon Sinek's podcast on the Golden Circle. You can just Google it, starts with why and Simon Sinek. Because it really sort of helps us figure out that bigger question of what we're trying to do. So certainly in the beginning, these were not easy conversations, as getting past things like collecting being the ultimate importance of the museum was a little bit challenging. And to be clear, I'm not saying that our collection isn't important. It's just that we don't exist solely to have a collection. The collection itself serves as a means to an end, which is the difference we're trying to make in our communities. Now, I'll be the first to admit that our why, which is made up of our vision and our aspiration, is fairly lofty, and it could probably be achieved in many different ways, not all of them necessarily requiring a museum to be fulfilled. But now that we're sort of in a time where government funding is shrinking, individuals have less disposable income, our being unable to quantifiably demonstrate the impact that we're having is presenting us with a real challenge. And so it's become critical for us at the WDM to be able to link what we do to the collecting, research, programming, exhibits of what we're doing. So being able to link to those specific impacts that we're having in terms of a real tangible way. And for us, what was sort of like the light bulb moment that went off was the connection we're able to make with John Falk's work on defining well-being specifically, because it's really given us a way to talk about what we're doing that actually resonates with people who aren't as passionate about museums as I am. Next slide, please. So we've taken John's well-being outcomes, and we're looking at it as both an outcome of our work, but also a driver of local impact. We've been really focused because we have 4 museums locations within our province. We're really focusing on, you know, the hyper local of how we're serving the communities where a WDM actually exists. And within that local value creation, and this is sort of some of the language that resonates with our provincial government and funders, is, you know, what are we doing economically? How are we building relationships? You know, what is the social capital that we're creating? And being able to take those concepts and tie them into the well-being outcomes that John Falk has defined for us, you know, personally, intellectually, socially, and physically, we've been able to really start to create a solid link between this is what we're doing and this is the benefits that it's having. So the model that we've created for ourselves is sort of a local regenerative value creation model, and it's become our strategic approach to strengthening communities, supporting local economies, and enhancing collective and individual well-being. And it's also allowing us to start to figure out how to define and measure these in a way that we can have our funders and our government supporters really understand and be able to support. So an example on the cultural side, where we're trying to, you know, nurture identity and creativity and create shared meaning. The well-being outcomes that we're working towards are enhancing intellectual, cultural well-being through co-creation, representation, and mutual respect. And what that means in practice for us is our ability to involve local voices in exhibit design and in exhibit interpretation. And that sort of comes from a nothing about us without us model that we've adopted. But we can actually start to measure this in a way of, you know, what is the percentage of co-curated exhibits that we've completed? What percentage of our programming features diverse local voices and stories? And so we're still refining how we actually track and report some of these things, but it's really gotten us very excited to be able to talk about how, you know, we're not just a museum, but we are an essential cultural infrastructure in our communities, and being able to use these well-being outcomes as a way of measuring and determining that is making a real difference for us. And now I'm going to turn it back to Kyle.
Thanks, Joan. Thanks, Amanda. It's a real gift to get to see, you know, this kind of work in progress. I know it is a work in progress. And I hope that it sparks for some of you, you know, some ideas. Maybe you can imagine some of this work playing out at your institution in 2026. So neither of the museums, you know, FJGMA or the Western Development Museum, are dismissing the expertise of educators and curators and marketers or designers or any of those other disciplines within the museum. I thought Joan pointed that out quite nicely. But they are asking, you know, every day, expertise to what end? So expertise matters, but it really is a means and not an end in itself. And you know, as I think about this as sort of a choice, right? So museums can continue to optimize for outputs. So, you know, that's things like peer recognition, disciplinary excellence, you know, great exhibits. And with that, you know, you still have a museum, and it could be a great museum. But that is a kind of narrowing of the perimeter around what the museum or the institution can accomplish and who it can support. So the alternative is, you know, to use outcomes as an organizing principle And that is different in that it's, fundamentally expansive in nature. So Joan and Amanda have shown us how they're really using these outcomes to expand capabilities to support the well-being of their communities. And I hope you all will follow in their footsteps. I shared the link. You can use the chat here in Zoom, or if you want to use our board here, you're welcome to use that beyond the session as well. Yeah, and I'd love to open it up for discussion. What do you think, Avi?
First of all, thank you all very much. This is a very inspiring language that we're using here, very positive language. And I very much appreciate the fact that you're able to make it concrete for us. These are not just abstractions, but actually guiding principles for everyday practice. The first question that I must say that occurs to me is that I've never seen an institution make any kind of change without pain and suffering, uh, otherwise known as resistance. Uh, and sometimes that's a good thing, as in maintaining democratic norms, for example. But I'd like to hear from each of you, all three of you actually, as to what were the most common or frequent forms of resistance and how did you address them?
I feel like that has to be a question for Amanda and Joan.
All right, pass the buck. Amanda?
Sure. I guess I'll go first. So I think the most frequent and I will say, to be honest, still heard pushback is I think there are some colleagues who may not understand their role as supporting these ideas necessarily. And I think, Kyle and Joan and I were talking previously about how sort of the low-hanging fruit for working with outcomes is to kind of shift this work over to an education department. And that's kind of where everybody thinks this is, these are the people who work with these things. And I just do the paint on the wall. Why do I need to think about that? Right? So it's kind of trying to show people that there is actually a whole world of impact that they're having without even being fully aware of it. And actually it was there was a little more resistance in the beginning, but now we're really starting to see people are getting excited. So for certain roles that might feel kind of divorced somewhat from the front facing kind of experience, to actually understand whether or not they see it every day, that they are really impacting everyone who comes into the museum. And so it sort of like opens up their own way of viewing their work in the museum. That's what I've seen so far.
Yeah, and for us, I think some of the biggest pushback that I've seen has been more, well, that's great. We've got our vision statement. It's aspirational, but I just need to do my job. And so being able to connect those things and start thinking about the work that we do in a different way in terms of measuring has become is probably the challenge that we're working with the most right now, because we've got our board and our funders on one side pushing, going, show us why you're important, and then we've got staff just wanting to do what they've always done. By keeping it sort of within that aspirational vision, it's like, well, it's a vision, we're never going to get there. So trying to be able to articulate the steps that get us there has probably been our biggest, and continues to be our biggest challenge. But it's
Great.
also the most fun to figure out.
I'll throw in a wild card real quick, Avi. As I'm thinking about, I'm obviously not at an institution. I'm supporting institutions, but I'm thinking of one, a different institution that we're working with now, and coming at it from a little bit of a different angle in terms of resistance, or sometimes it's not overt resistance. It's more like just keep doing what I'm doing, right? And one of the things we're discussing with them is actually baking in this language. And Amanda mentioned, the common language. actually baking it into certain HR touch points, right? So talking about, you know, as candidates come through, like what does it mean for us to, you know, right now we're really focused on, you know, supporting these intellectual outcomes, and what does that bring up for you? And it's, you know, it's not, it's just a way of kind of, I always think of it as softening the ground, right? Of the new generation of people who are coming into the institution. And it goes back to that idea of it is everyone's work, even those deep back of house seats, who are maybe not so back of house because they are populating, right? They are feeding into those folks who will be frontline personnel. So
Great. Thank you all very much. I want to point out that we have not only 3 hands up, but I see 3 wonderful questions in the chat function. So I'm going to ask each of the questioners to keep your questions short and pointed, and the answers short and pointed as well. Emlyn, you're on. You'll need to unmute yourself, Emlyn.
Okay, great presentations. Thanks, Abby. I would like to suggest respectfully that there is an upstream point, sort of before we get to the why, how, and what, which is a very commendable approach structure. In a changing world in which museums strive to be, in new ways, supportable, sustainable, meaningful, there is a world that I think has posing new questions that the museum sector should begin to answer, and it's not my sense particularly, but I think that the world needs museums to think fundamentally differently, if they could, about why they exist in the first place, which is upstream of even thinking about a collection. What is the purpose of the museum with respect to the world's environmental and societal problems? What can you back into? And only with that upfront generative question can you really begin to answer then by what means and ends do you proceed. Obviously, for museums that exist already, this is a tough one. But for museums that are new, and there are new museums opening in the world, I wish that I would see more often that they're first of all being driven by a sense of in what way can the institution called museum that inspires inspiration be fundamentally about a new and important challenge that the world faces, and back into that with the means of the museum as a vehicle to that end.
Great. Would any of the 3 of you like to respond to that comment? Okay. All right, I'm prepared. Thank you, Emlyn. A good statement. Jeremiah, you're on.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Fabulous. Okay. So I'm actually Angela. Jeremiah is my wonderful supervisor.
I beg your pardon, Angela.
Well, no, that's okay. Everybody gets confused. My question partially will lead into Mina's question that's in the chat. I guess my question is, this is wonderful. How do we bridge these conversations? How do we broach and then bridge these conversations moving from outputs to outcomes when we're talking about 2 stakeholders, 1, potential partners, where you're trying to get community groups or the community at large to see the value in coming into your institution, because oftentimes the community doesn't think that their voices and their lived experiences will be reflected in a museum because it's about things that are far removed from them. Whether that's true or not, that is often a perception. So how do we move from those outputs to the outcomes in conversation? How do we begin those conversations? I know we talked about packing things up when we're talking about internally, but when we're talking about funders and then potential partners in terms of creating visitors and trust there, how do we start those conversations?
Thank you for that question. Folks? Amanda, you want to take a shot?
I'm happy to talk a little bit about what we've been doing, particularly around trust building. So one of the things for us in Saskatchewan, we have a very young but also growing Indigenous population. And so we've really been working on having a lot of conversations and a lot of basically tea and coffee with people to find out what Indigenous communities would want from the WDM. And, it's fair to describe our founding as a colonial settler institution. And as we've been working particularly on inclusion and truth and reconciliation in our organization, we've really spent a lot of time just talking to people and listening and opening the doors, but not coming in with a, we want to do something, more of a, how can we help serve what your community needs, or is there a place for us? And so we've been fortunate to have a couple of projects. Our first project started as a photo naming project. We had all of these photos that we didn't know who they were, and we went to the community. We built a relationship with the chief and council and the elders, and they eventually came to us and said, we want an exhibit. And we went, okay, but you're curating this exhibit with us. We're not going to tell you what your history is. But that took like 4 or 5 years to get to the point where we finally had an exhibit, because that kind of a partnership, it takes a lot of time to build that trust, and you just have to allow it to take the time that it needs. I don't know if that answered the question, but that's sort of how we've been doing it.
Gotcha.
Thank you.
Amanda or Kyle, either? Thank you very much, Angela, for the question, and Joan for the answer. Megan?
Yes, I noticed that when you put up the list for reasons why your staff believed that people attended museums, I didn't notice to have your perspective challenged. And that's actually, in my work, transformative design, I see that coming up and over again. People want a growth experience. They actually want to come out with something new that they've learned about, something that they feel has an aspect, like even a change of identity coming out of it. So it's interesting because you're talking a lot about change here, but one part of it is the invitation to change. So I'm wondering if you have any clear examples of what you've done, either with your staff, or I would love to know what you've done with your patrons to invite them into the space, to be open to, this invitation to change. And because this is what I'm actually lecturing about this next week, about what creates super fans, the people who are regular patrons, who donate, who are big fans and help promote your work on social media. And they're reporting, super fans are reporting, it's because they've had a change-based experience. They've actually it's an aspect of their identity, this museum. But to do that, we have to invite them into that space. So I'm wondering what you've done in your work that is this invitation to people, the invitation to change and to be challenged. Thank you.
I just want to jump in and say, yeah, that's I shared in the link actually the full list to the various outcomes. And Megan, I think what you're pointing to is really important, and it's not one that I put up on the slides, but it's in there. I think it's related. What you're describing is related to an outcome called discover something new about themselves, right? And interestingly, this is something I want to explore more in writing and stuff, but it is that particular outcome is consistently the one that museum professionals who have participated in our assessment are the least confident that their museum provides, universally at the bottom. So that's a really fascinating question. If we can say that, discover something new about myself is an educational outcome, and museums are presumably operating in this kind of educational mindset, and they believe that that's so much of the value that they provide. What does it mean that they're least confident that that is what they offer? And so I put that out there just to acknowledge what you're saying. It is accounted for, but it's definitely a wide open sort of territory. And I don't know if I answered your question or added anything to that, but Joan or Amanda, anything that comes to you?
If I could add just one suggestion, is to have a debrief area. So after the experience, after they've gone through the experience of the museum, to have a space to collect that input from the people on what this experience was. How was it making for them, and how was it change making for them? And that's I see that's missing in a lot of design is this idea of framing the experience for the patron. So the invitation to come in, the onboarding, if you will, the experience itself, and then the debrief afterwards, which is actually where people process what they've experienced. Where so many museums miss that, which is that space for me to process this entire experience and make sense of it and think about how is this going to apply to my life outside of this museum? When I walk out that door, how am I a different person?
Great. Megan, thank you for both the comment and question, and thank you for the quick responses. John, you have an opportunity to jump in.
Okay, and thanks for that comment, Megan. What I would offer is the irony of this is that given that by nature people are self-oriented, one of the most common, if not the single most common outcome of a museum experience is that people find out more about themselves because they're viewing this experience through their own personal lens and making sense of it through their own constructive processes. But correctly, museums actually don't help by helping folks close that loop. But the pushback I would suggest is the place for helping users close that loop may be at the end of that visit, but actually it's more likely to occur if you stay connected and support people over time, because these experiences only can be appreciated over time as opposed to while you're in the box. So it makes it more challenging, but in fact, that is, the opportunity is there because that's what everybody is doing, trying to do. And we as a field have not been particularly adept at supporting people in coming to closure with that, helping them do that.
Great. John, thank you for that comment. I'm going to ask Jason Harris, who posed a wonderful question in the chat, to jump in. Jason, would you care to put your question directly?
Sure. What I was thinking was, as you look at these types of outcomes and you implement them, how do we kind of avoid mission creep and stay focused on what your institution's really about, rather than drifting on to what funders or others might see as beneficial outcomes?
Oh, shots fired. There's a, what is the institution really about? Is the institution really about providing, these kind of individual well-being outcomes for the people that it supports? I think that there's a lot of discussion to be had around, what do we want to, if we can take for granted, that institutions do provide all these different outcomes, but we may be able to provide, outsized outcomes for people in our community, given what the alternatives are, right, locally for people to pursue these outcomes. I would say that, certainly more than one, but let's just simplify and say one or more of these outcomes is the business of the museum. It is the purpose of the museum. So I don't know, what does that bring up for you though, Jason? Because what do you mean when you say, how did you put it? Getting distracted maybe from the purpose of the museum. What is it if it's not providing value to users?
Well, so I've worked at several different institutions, large and small. And I can see where being outcome-based like this is easier to do in some situations than it is others. And so really I'm looking at, from the experiences of those who are on the panel, like at their institutions, how did they kind of negate mission drift and kind of remain committed to kind of their overall project goals and their overall mission as they built these out? Because it's not a giant step, right? It's one big step at a time to get in that direction.
Joan and Amanda, are you drifting?
I would say not, but maybe I have colleagues who would say yes. No, honestly, so because we just, as I mentioned, sort of where our museum is at right now, and the reason that was important is because we are really rebuilding everything, including our mission, we rewrote all of it, and our strategic plan. And so our mission statement includes outcome type language. That is our mission. And so that is what we're after. And we haven't drifted from that as far as I can tell. But it doesn't come out in these really big ways. It's very small, incremental, little tiny things that you notice as you go. And we're very much in the beginning stages of this. So we may experience moments of drift that we just haven't gotten to yet. But I think it's important to remember that it's possible, but that the outcomes are part of the mission, and we hang on to that.
Yeah, and I think for us, I consciously think about mission drift all of the time because we get a lot of pressure from different funding sources to do things to match what they want to fund, whether it makes sense for us to do it or not. But we're really, really clear. We don't pick all of the outcomes that are possible. We pick the ones that make the most sense for us as an organization that's tied to what it is that we're really, really good at doing. So we're not trying to do everything. We're just trying to pick outcomes where, what we're collecting has a positive impact in our communities, what we're exhibiting, what our programs are. So we try to avoid mission drift just by being really, really focused in terms of what it is we can do versus everything that's possible out there.
Great. Excellent question. Wonderful responses. Meena Selva Kumar posed an interesting question in the chat. Meena, would you care to put that personally? No response. Steve, I'm going to give you a chance to
I'm
put your
sorry,
question.
I was unable to mute. Thank you,
Thank
Abby.
you.
Yes, I was curious about trust and relationship building. And actually, interestingly, as we were talking about organizational change, both within the museum as you're going through this change, as well as with your community, if your programs are working with communities, like, is that something that can be measured?
I'm sorry, I don't think I quite caught the question. Can you say again, Meena?
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. My brain just can't keep up. So can you repeat it?
I was curious about trust and relationship building, because when you are creating this kind of value, you are also creating different kinds of impacts. And when I was writing that question, I was thinking mostly about how you would assess or measure, what are the indicators of those outcomes with your community. But since we were also talking about organizational change, if that is something that can be measured internally as well.
My short answer is we're still figuring it out. But in terms of community, and these aren't, statistically valued or, statistical measures that we can replicate, but we look at, what is the level of trust that we have with the community that we're working with? And when that community comes to us and says, we want you to take care of some of our most sacred materials, we count that as a level of trust that we've built, but it's not something that we could do a survey on or measure. So we're still figuring out that measurement piece of it. It's not easy to measure outcomes, unfortunately.
Yeah, for I think I hear you alluding to, there's the internal and the external, right? And just as an interesting example of the internal, one of the things we're talking about with a new institution we're working with is kind of an experience sampling method. So one of the challenges that they're facing is, they have a rather entrenched department of interpreters and who believe that the museum's purpose is to convey, facts, and I think that that's valuable to an extent, and they that's what they want to do. But the leadership often finds themselves having to kind of intervene and redirect, right? Like, we want to go in this outcomes direction. So with the experience sampling, what we're doing is, we're getting a before and after snapshot, right? So before, we're gonna be checking in at random moments with key leaders to get a more accurate view of how much time and resources they're actually spending on this redirection, right? Then we're coming in with an intervention, right? So a little pilot program, similar to this VRC that Amanda and Joan are program that they're in. And then measuring after, doing that same sampling. Like, are we actually spending less time, on this kind of unsavory redirecting work? So that's kind of the process, right? We want to have objective measures. But to Joan's point, yeah, I mean, it is an experiment, right? We have to experiment with different ways to figure this out, and it's not always easy.
Thank you very much for the question, and thank you for the response. Stephen, you put an interesting question into the chat. Would you care to throw it out while we've got 2 minutes left in our time?
How do the museums represented here, I'll have to read my question, invite and use public, however that is defined, in making decisions? It was touched on with the indigenous community example, which I thought was terrific. But how do you define your public, and how or do you involve them in making decisions regarding the kinds of things you've been talking about today?
I can talk a little bit about what we're doing. We're certainly starting to figure out how to involve a broader public in our conversations about, our programming and what it is we're doing. We started our whole process with an internal assessment of where we were in terms of inclusion and truth and reconciliation. And then we just started creating that as part of our strategic plan, identifying huge gaps in the stories that we tell, and starting to then identify and work with specific communities. So we've been doing a lot of outreach to be able to do that. But it's, we're still looking at ways that we can get even, broader input in terms of the things that we're doing. So I'm always open to ideas and suggestions if anybody has any.
I don't, because it's tough. And you touched on that when you talked about funders telling you what they want you to do. You can ask everybody in the world, and everybody will have a different reason why you should exist. You have to define and settle into that and say, thank you very much. That's a great idea. We'll take that under consideration, but here's what we do. It's not easy.
I would suggest, by the way, that as somebody mentioned tea, or actually more nearly tea and sympathy.
Yes.
My own experience over a dozen years in Baltimore was a monthly brown bag lunch with 6 to 10 people from the community. The lunch cost us practically nothing at all, but we had people in our hands for an hour and a half. They got to know who we were, and we got to hear their perspectives on the museum. Some of them had never been, some of them had been many times. Some had very strong and decided opinions about what we should be doing, and others were open and were more in the question learner mode. But those brown bag lunches became a regular feature, and they led in many cases to new programs, new exhibitions, new projects in the community, and most importantly, to new community alliances and partnerships. One of our measures of success in Baltimore.
Lost your voice, Harry.
Sorry. I'm gonna call. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. One of our measures of success was how many partnerships and alliances our museum had each year. And I didn't know another museum in Baltimore that counted those things. But for us, they were very, very powerful devices. We're at the end of the hour. Kyle, I'm sorry, I will give you a chance for a benediction. Uh, a reminder that we will convene again in December to talk about new art museums. And by the way, for those of you who have not been to art museums recently, they are really, in many ways, at cutting edges, especially on diversity initiatives in their galleries, the representations in their galleries. So this is a more universal thing and not limited to art museums. But my thanks to everyone for joining us. Special thanks to Kyle, Amanda, and Joan. And Kyle, if you would like to offer a short benediction, the floor is yours.
No, I was just gonna follow. On Stephen's point, I was just gonna say that how we frame or approach the question is so important, right? I think that it's quite common for us to say, hey, let's try to include the public in deciding what the museum should do, or where should it go, or what, how we can better represent folks. And there's a different way to approach this, which is to say, what are the outcomes that we think we can support? And let's learn how people approach those outcomes, and then use our expertise to see where a museum might fit in a unique way. So the question isn't, how can we represent you in a museum? You're not a museum professional. You're that's not necessarily your job to know that. It is to, go in and say, hey, how do you go about, I'll use our VRC participants. They are doing this study now. They're studying newcomers to their areas, their cities and regions. And they're not saying, hey, newcomers, how can we make our museum more welcoming to you? They're saying, how do you go about feeling a sense of connection in your new home? And then we'll do the work of figuring out how we might be able to insert ourselves meaningfully in your experience. Very different way of approaching it. Stepping off my soapbox, Avi, thank you so much for having us.
It is a pleasure to welcome you in the Museums in Progress posse here. And I really do think that what you're asking us to do is to shoulder a kind of responsibility that we have managed to avoid for generations, and to really make Stephen Weil's question about who are we for a really meaningful and powerful part of our everyday practice. So thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us. I urge you to look at the chat function, because there have been a wealth of wonderful comments, suggestions, and questions in there, enough to keep us going, certainly for another couple of weeks till our next session. In the meanwhile, take care. Be well.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.